I was 8 years old the night my father stopped being my dad. I remember standing at the top of the stairs, my small hands gripping the wooden railing as I watched him zip up a navy suitcase. The sound was sharp and final, like a door closing on everything I knew. My mother stood in the hallway below, her voice shaking as she begged him to reconsider. She didn't yell or scream. She just asked him to think about us, about me. My father didn't look at her with anger or sadness. He just looked tired, like he'd already made his decision long before packing that suitcase. He glanced up at me on the stairs, and for a moment, our eyes met. I thought he might say something important, something I'd remember forever. Instead, he said 4 words that changed everything. I deserve more than this. Then he added, almost like an afterthought, one day you'll understand. I didn't understand. I was 8. I only understood that he was leaving, and nobody could stop him. The front door closed behind him, and the sound echoed through the empty house. That night, everything felt different. The air was colder. The silence was louder. My mother came upstairs and held me without saying anything, and I realized she didn't know how to explain this either. A week later, I saw the photographs. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her friend, clicking through her phone with a look of pain I'd never seen before. I wasn't supposed to look, but I did. There's my father, smiling wider than I'd ever seen him smile. His arm was around a woman with blonde hair and perfect makeup, and they stood on a deck overlooking a beautiful lake. The water sparkled behind them like the picture was taken from a movie. The woman's hand rested on his chest, the way you hold something you're afraid of losing. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged together. That's what hurt the most. At school the next day, kids whispered when I walked past. I didn't understand why until Tommy Richardson said his older brother had seen the photos too. Your dad's with someone new, he said, like it was something I should already know. My face burned with embarrassment, even though I didn't understand why my father's choices should make me feel ashamed. At home, things got worse. A notice came in the mail about the mortgage. My mother sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the paper like it might change if she looked at it long enough. I pretended I didn't notice. I pretended things were still normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The lake house in those photos seemed to exist in a different world, one that my father had decided he deserved more than ours. I'll never forget the day my mother checked our bank account. She was sitting at the desk in our bedroom, trying to figure out how to pay the bills. Her fingers moved across the keyboard slowly, carefully, like she was afraid of what she'd find. When the number appeared on the screen, her whole body went still. The balance was $312.47. Everything else was gone. Years of savings. Money that was supposed to pay for my school, my future, my life. My father had drained it all. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't leave a note explaining. He just took it and disappeared. I expected my mother to scream. I expected her to throw things or cry so hard she couldn't breathe. But she didn't do any of those things. She just sat down slowly on the edge of the bed and stared at nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and steady. "We'll figure it out," she said. Just like that. No panic. No despair. Just determination. That's when I stopped being a child. I was still 8 years old, still in elementary school, still sleeping with a stuffed animal. But inside, something shifted. I understood that adults couldn't always protect me. I understood that people you trusted could hurt you in ways that seemed impossible. And I understood that sometimes you had to be stronger than you thought you could be. The eviction notice came 6 months later. I watched as strangers walked through our house, their footsteps echoing in the hallway like they owned the place. A man pointed to the crown molding in the living room and asked about the square footage. A woman opened the closet in my bedroom and said something about storage space. These were good things about our house, but hearing them described like that made me feel like my home was being picked apart and sold to the highest bidder. Within a year, we had to leave. I packed my belongings into boxes and said goodbye to the rooms where I'd grown up. My mother drove us to a small apartment across town, and I watched our old house disappear in the rearview mirror. A few days after we moved, I drove past the gated lake community, where my father now lived. I didn't plan to go there. My feet just took me. Through the gates, I could see the houses, big, beautiful houses with perfectly manicured lawns. One of them was his. The lake house from the photographs. He'd chosen this. He'd looked at his family, looked at the life we'd built together, and decided that this was better. That same year, a birthday card arrived with no return address. It had my name on the front, written in his handwriting. Inside was a check for $50. No message. No note. No explanation. No apology. Then nothing. No more cards. No phone calls. No visits. Just silence stretching on, like he'd disappeared from our lives completely. And in a way, he had. That night, I overheard my mother talking to her friend on the phone. They were in the living room of our tiny apartment, and she thought I was asleep. Her voice was broken and exhausted as she said the words that would change everything for me. He chose money, she said quietly. He chose that woman and that house and whatever life he thought he deserved more than he chose us. I lay in my bed and listened to her cry softly, and something hardened inside me. Something cold and determined crystallized in my chest. I made myself a promise that night, in the darkness of my small bedroom in our small apartment. No one would ever have that kind of power over me. No one would ever be able to make me feel that worthless. No one would ever get to walk away from me and leave me with nothing but pain and questions. I would be smarter than that. I would be stronger than that. I would build a life so solid, so real, so impossible to destroy that no person could ever touch it. I didn't know how yet, but I knew it was possible. I could see it like a light in the distance, and I promised myself I would reach it, no matter what it took. 20 years passed. I was 28 years old now, and I lived in a world of documents and numbers. My name is Cynthia, and I'm a forensic attorney specializing in corporate compliance. That meant I looked for lies hidden in plain sight, numbers that didn't add up, signatures that didn't match, money that disappeared into accounts that didn't exist. I was good at it because I understood something about lying. I understood that people who wanted to hide the truth usually left clues. They always thought they were smarter than they were. They always made mistakes. My firm was called Harrison and Associates, and we handled investigations that other lawyers didn't want to touch. I'd built my career on being calm, precise, and absolutely relentless. My boss called me the best investigator she'd ever seen. What she didn't know was that I investigated because it made me feel in control. Every case I solved, every criminal I helped catch, was a small way of taking back power from a world that had stolen mine. One afternoon, my boss called me into her office. She had a new case, something big. A healthcare investment group was suspected of financial misconduct. The Securities and Exchange Commission was getting involved. Someone had filed a complaint about missing documentation and irregular property transfers. This was going to be complicated, she said, but she wanted my best work. I told her yes before she even finished explaining the details. I needed this case. I didn't know why yet. The moment I opened the file and saw the CEO's name, the air left my lungs. Victor Harrison. My father. 20 years of absence, and here he was in black and white, listed as the head of a major corporation. My hands shook as I read through the company information. He'd become everything he'd always wanted to be. Successful. Wealthy. Important. He'd built an empire from the lake house and beyond. And now that empire was under investigation. Now his success was about to come crashing down. I almost called my boss and told her I needed to step off the case. I almost said there was a conflict of interest, a connection that would compromise my objectivity. But then I thought about my mother in that tiny apartment. I thought about the $50 check with no message. I thought about the lake house that he'd chosen over us. So I didn't tell her anything. I just said I was ready to begin. When I walked into the executive conference room for the first time, my father was there. He didn't recognize me immediately. I'd changed my name when I got married to Morrison, then kept it after the divorce. I was 5'6" instead of 3'11". I had his dark hair, but I'd cut it short. I dressed in professional suits instead of school uniforms. But when he looked up from his papers and his eyes met mine, something shifted in his face. The moment stretched. Then his eyes widened slightly as recognition flickered across his features. "Cynthia," he whispered, the word barely audible. It was just for half a second. Just the smallest flicker of confirmation. But it was enough. That flicker told me he knew exactly who I was. His wife was there too, sitting at the conference table like she owned the room. She was still beautiful, in that polished way that money could buy. Her blonde hair was perfect, her jewelry was expensive, and her manicure was flawless. She'd aged well, or at least she'd aged with the help of good doctors and better makeup. When she looked at me, there was no recognition in her eyes. I was staff to her. Someone hired to do a job. She treated me with the kind of cold politeness that rich people use when they don't want to remember someone's name. "Thank you for coming to review our files," she said, not quite looking at me. "We're confident there's been some kind of misunderstanding." I smiled and said that was what we were here to determine. My father watched this exchange carefully. I could see him trying to calculate what was happening. He knew who I was, but he didn't know if I was going to tell him yet. He didn't know if this was going to be a professional interaction or a personal confrontation. The uncertainty in his eyes was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. He'd spent 20 years not thinking about what he'd left behind. Now he was about to spend a lot more time thinking about nothing else. The audit began the next Monday. I had full access to the company's financial records, and I spent days, then weeks, going through thousands of documents. Numbers don't lie. That's what I always told people. But numbers can hide things. They can be moved around and disguised. They can be made to look like one thing when they actually mean something completely different. Irregular property transfers. That was the first red flag. Money had moved from company accounts to personal accounts, but the documentation was incomplete. Missing receipts. Missing verification. Missing explanations. Then there were the shell accounts. Old ones that should have been closed years ago. They were still active, and they still had traces of movement. Money flowing in, then out, then somewhere else. It was like following a trail through a maze, except every turn led to another question. After 3 weeks of digging, I found something that made my stomach twist. A date. 20 years ago. The exact year my father left us. My hands actually shook as I pulled the file. The document was buried deep in archived records, the kind of thing that should have been destroyed, but somehow survived in the back of a cabinet. It was a property liquidation form. The signature at the bottom said it had been approved by my mother. Except I knew my mother's signature. I'd seen it thousands of times on permission slips and birthday cards and checks. And this wasn't it. The signature was close enough that someone who didn't know her might believe it. But I knew. This was a forgery. Someone had copied her name carefully, trying to match her handwriting. But there were tiny differences. The way the P curved. The way the A looped. These were the kinds of things that professional investigators could spot, and I was very professional. The document showed the sale of a property that should have been family assets. Money from that sale had gone straight to my father's personal accounts. That money had funded the lake house. That money had bought his new life. That money had come from stealing from my mother. From stealing from me. I drove to my mother's apartment that night without calling first. She was sitting in her living room watching television, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she knew something was wrong. I didn't waste time with explanations. I just handed her the copy of the forged signature. Her hands started shaking the moment she saw it. She sat down slowly on her couch, staring at the paper like it was written in a language she didn't understand. "I never signed this," she whispered. "I never authorized anything. I never would have." Her voice got quieter. That lake house was supposed to be partly ours. From the inheritance my grandmother left me. He told me he needed the money for a business investment. He said it would help secure our future. She looked at me with eyes full of pain and anger mixed together. He lied about everything. I sat next to her, and we didn't speak for a long time. The television played quietly in the background. Outside, the city hummed with people living their lives, completely unaware that my world was shifting on its axis. But not in the way I'd expected. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was just ready. I was ready to show my father that his lies had consequences. I was ready to take everything back, not for revenge, but for justice. I didn't confront him. I didn't yell or accuse or demand explanations. That wouldn't have been professional. Instead, I escalated everything through proper channels. I brought the forged signature to my boss. I explained what I'd found and why it mattered. The audit expanded. The forensic team got involved. Federal compliance officers started asking questions. Forgery. Financial misrepresentation. These were serious charges, the kind that didn't just end a career. They ended lives. The investigation grew like a virus, spreading through the company's finances. Every document we looked at revealed new problems. Every interview with employees uncovered more lies. My father had built his entire empire on deception, and now that deception was unraveling in real time. I watched from a distance, stayed professional, and let the system work. The law didn't care about personal feelings. The law cared about facts. And the facts were destroying him. Word spread quietly through the investment community. Two major investors who were supposed to add millions to the company's next expansion pulled out. They didn't say why, not publicly. But rumors travel fast in that world. People were asking questions. People were becoming nervous. I started noticing changes in how my father acted in meetings. Gone was the confidence, the arrogance, the certainty that he could charm his way out of any situation. Now he was careful. Now he was polite. Now he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. One afternoon, he asked if we could talk privately. I said no. I told him everything would go through proper legal channels. His wife began asking him questions in the meetings, her perfect smile faltering as she realized that her husband might have made serious mistakes. I could see her calculating, reassessing, wondering if her golden ticket was about to expire. He cornered me in the parking garage one evening. I was walking to my car when he appeared, and for a moment, I was 8 years old again, small and scared. Then the moment passed, and I was myself, 28, strong, and completely prepared for this. He didn't look like the man from the photographs anymore. He looked tired. He looked afraid. "Cynthia," he said, his voice rough. "We need to talk. We need to fix this." He said we were family. He said mistakes had been made. He said we could settle things quietly if I was willing to listen. Then he offered me money. A lot of money. More than I made in a year. He thought he could buy his way out of this, the same way he'd tried to buy his way into a new life. I looked at him calmly and told him I didn't work off the record. I told him everything was documented and professional. I told him the investigation would follow its course. As I drove away, I could see him in my mirror, standing alone in the parking garage. He'd tried to control the situation with money, just like he always did. But money couldn't help him now. Federal compliance officers stepped in. They were serious people with serious paperwork, and they didn't care about his explanations or his excuses. His accounts were temporarily frozen pending review. Millions of dollars locked away. His company was put under provisional management. His access to company files was restricted. For the first time in 20 years, my father didn't have absolute control. His wife hired her own attorney, separate from his. I saw her in the hallway one day, and she looked at him like he was a stranger. Maybe to her he was. Maybe she'd only ever loved the successful version, and now that he was failing, there was nothing left to love. I watched it all happen like I was watching a movie. The man who'd seemed invincible when I was 8 was crumbling in front of me. But I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd thought I would feel. Instead, I felt something more complicated. I felt like I was watching someone understand, too late, that his choices had consequences. His secretary stopped making eye contact with him. His colleagues who'd once laughed at his jokes suddenly had meetings they needed to attend. The golden boy of the investment world was becoming invisible, and nobody wanted to be seen standing next to him. I attended a board meeting where one of his longest business partners stood up and said they were dissolving their partnership effective immediately. The man looked shocked, like he couldn't believe that loyalty had an expiration date. But of course it did. Loyalty from people who only liked you for your money was always temporary. It lasted exactly as long as the money did. I thought about my mother, about how she'd stood by him for years. How she'd supported his dreams and his ambitions. How she'd been loyal not because he was successful, but because she loved him. And he'd repaid that loyalty by stealing from her. The irony was sharp and clear. He traded a woman who would have stayed for a woman who disappeared the moment things got difficult. He'd traded real love for the appearance of love. And now he was learning that appearance doesn't keep you warm at night. I watched his face as he realized this truth. For a moment, I felt almost sorry for him. Almost. It happened during a tense board meeting. My father was sitting at the head of the table, and one of the federal officers was presenting findings from the investigation. The officer was explaining about shell accounts and irregular transfers, using words like fraud and conspiracy. My father's face was getting redder. His breathing was getting faster. Then he clutched his chest and made a sound like he couldn't breathe. He fell forward onto the table. Chaos erupted. People were shouting. Someone called 911. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, and I watched paramedics load my father onto a stretcher. His wife wasn't even there. She was in her attorney's office, protecting her assets. The man I'd spent 20 years planning to destroy was being rushed to the hospital, and the only person who seemed to care was the woman investigating him. At the hospital, doctors told him it was a heart attack. During tests, they mentioned a hereditary heart condition, the kind that ran in families, the kind you could inherit. I sat in the waiting room, and my stomach dropped. I'd had symptoms before. Chest pain that came and went. Shortness of breath when I exercised. Palpitations that scared me. I'd meant to get tested. I'd always meant to. But I'd been so focused on my career, on my investigation, on my revenge, that I'd neglected my own health. My father knew about this condition. The records would show that. He'd been diagnosed before he left us. He never told my mother. He never told me. He'd let us live our lives without knowing that we might have a time bomb in our chests, and he never even cared enough to mention it. I requested his old medical files. The doctors were reluctant at first, but I explained that I was his daughter and that it was important. The records confirmed everything. My father had been diagnosed with hereditary cardiomyopathy 15 years ago, before he left us, before we started our lives without him. And he'd never told anyone. He'd kept it a secret, protecting himself, letting us walk around without knowing something that could save our lives. That betrayal hurt more than the money. That betrayal hurt more than the abandonment. He'd taken the gift of knowledge from us, and it could have cost us everything. I made an appointment with a cardiologist the next day. I got tested. The results came back positive. I had the same condition. It would require management and medication and regular monitoring, but it was treatable. If I'd waited much longer, if I'd never investigated my father, I might never have known until it was too late. So, in a way, my investigation had saved my life. It had taken revenge to give me the truth I needed to survive. While my father was in the hospital, his wife came to visit once. Just once. She stayed for 15 minutes, and I watched from a distance as she held his hand without really touching it. Then she left and she never came back. A week later, her attorney filed for legal separation. She was protecting her assets, they said. She didn't want to be held liable for his crimes. She was abandoning him the same way he'd abandoned us. Except this time he knew how it felt. He had no money. He had no company. He had no power. And now he had no wife. The woman he'd chosen over his family was choosing to leave him when he needed her most. The irony was so clear it almost made me laugh. History was repeating itself, and this time, he was the one being left behind. The company dissolved. There were fines and settlements. Investors lost money, and they were angry. My father's reputation never recovered. Everything he'd built was crumbling to dust. And then came the lake house. Due to mounting legal pressure and frozen accounts, several properties were ordered liquidated to cover the financial settlements. The lake house, the physical symbol of his betrayal, the place he'd chosen over us, was going to auction. I read about it in the legal notices. The same house from the photographs. The same house where he'd smiled wider than I'd ever seen him smile. The same house that had been bought with money stolen from my mother. It was being sold to the highest bidder. I placed a bid through a legal trust. Not impulsively. I was too smart for that. I was too careful. I calculated the numbers precisely, determined what the house was worth, and bid accordingly. I wanted to win, but I wanted to win cleanly. I wanted to win with my own money that I'd earned with my own work. And I won. When the auction closed, I was the highest bidder. The lake house was mine. For a moment, I felt the rush of victory. But it didn't last as long as I'd expected it to. Revenge, I was learning, was more complicated than I'd thought. It wasn't a simple thing with a clear ending. It was a process that took pieces of you as it went. Closing day arrived. My father was there, thin and pale. The doctors said his heart was weak. They said he needed to be careful. He looked at the paperwork as it slid across the table, and his eyes found the name of the purchaser. The trust in my name. He understood immediately. His hands started shaking. He didn't say anything. He just stared at the document like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Like he was trying to rewrite reality with his eyes. But he couldn't. The lake house was mine now. The symbol of his betrayal belonged to me. I announced my plans for the property. I was going to convert it into a women's financial recovery retreat. A place where women going through divorces or leaving abusive relationships or recovering from financial betrayal could go to learn about managing their money and protecting themselves. I was going to name it after my mother. The room went silent when I explained this. Even my father's attorneys seemed shocked. He'd assumed I'd bought the house to hurt him, to throw his failure in his face. But that wasn't what this was about. This was about transformation. This was about taking the symbol of his greed and turning it into a place of healing. The retreat opened 6 months later. My mother cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, her hands steady and her smile genuine. She didn't know how hard I'd fought to get there. She just knew that something beautiful had come from something ugly. And that was enough. Weeks after the retreat opened, my father asked to see me. He was living in a small apartment now, far from the gates and the wealth. His health was declining. The doctors had told him to expect limitations. He had maybe 5, maybe 10 years if he was careful. When we sat down across from each other, there was no arrogance, no excuses, just an old man looking at his daughter, finally seeing what he'd lost. I thought I was choosing better, he said quietly. When I left, I thought I was leveling up, choosing a better version of my life. I listened. I didn't interrupt. But I wasn't choosing better. I was just choosing easier. He looked at me, and I've spent 20 years realizing the cost. My father lived for another 8 years after that meeting. 8 years of watching the women's retreat help hundreds of people rebuild their lives. 8 years of knowing that his greatest betrayal had become the foundation for something good. 8 years of regret that grew heavier every single day. He died alone in his small apartment, and the woman he'd chosen over his family never called. His funeral was small. His former business associates didn't attend. The colleagues he'd worked with for decades sent no flowers. But at the retreat, we continued. We helped woman after woman protect their finances and rebuild their confidence. We helped them understand that abandonment said nothing about their worth. Every woman who walked through those doors carried the same pain my mother and I had carried. Some had been left like she was. Some had been stolen from like we were. Some had been betrayed in ways that seemed unforgivable. And now they didn't have to carry that pain alone. I thought often about my father during those 8 years. I thought about the man in the Navy suitcase, packing his life away. I thought about the photographs at the lake house. I thought about the choice he made, moment by moment, to build his empire on lies. I thought about how his success had never been real because it was built on stolen foundation. And I realized something important. Revenge wasn't what had healed me. It was purpose. It was taking something broken and turning it into something that could help others. Every woman who walked out of that retreat stronger, more confident, more prepared to protect herself, that was my real victory. That was what my father's regret had cost him. Not just his money or his reputation or his health. He'd lost the chance to be part of something meaningful. He'd lost the opportunity to watch his daughter build a life of real value. He'd lost the connection to the only people who would have loved him unconditionally. My father lost everything because he'd walked away from the only people who would have stayed. And that regret, that painful understanding of what he'd thrown away, he carried it for the rest of his life. It was written in the lines of his face. It was heard in the silence, when he had nothing left to say. It was the truest consequence of his choices. And in a strange way, his regret became the most important part of my story, not as punishment, but as proof that choices matter, that people matter, that the lives we abandon are the lives we'll spend forever wishing we could reclaim.